Today I am going to analyze Risk of Rain 2's enemy spawner, which they aptly call the Director. So a couple talking points here involving the Director include spawner currency, which they call credits, enemy variety, enemy scaling, and downtime. So I think that this is one of the better implementations of an enemy spawner system, even though it's not perfect, but we'll get into that. So how it works, the spawner has a credit system which scales over time. So the longer the game goes on, the more credits that the spawner has to spend. The Director then can spawn whatever they like within the enemy pool based on the cost of each unit. So some cost 1 each, some cost 2 each, so on and so on. Credit total increases with time, as all the other systems do, so it goes back to a core design pillar of the game, in that the longer you stay in it, the harder it gets. Now, as far as variety, and which you'll see throughout all of the clips here, it starts rather simple with regular enemies and sometimes electric or fire or ice version of an enemy, which are called elites. And then certain notches increase the difficulty and add new enemies into the Director enemy pool. Eventually, they'll be able to choose boss monsters in addition to other enemies to add to what they're spawning. Now, I mentioned downtime earlier, and here is a great example of this. There are certain parts where the player will start to outscale the game. So you can see there's a decent amount of downtime, which does kind of conflict with one of the pillars that is presented throughout playing the game, which is pacing and the sense of urgency that always exists. It seems to struggle the most whenever the player is staying still, as you saw in the previous clip and this one as well. Usually when you stick around a spot and kind of kill all the enemies that are there and just hang out for a minute, it takes a while for the Director to get things back to you and give you something to do. It's not terrible at it, it's just not as consistent. So I think the Director kind of anticipates that you're going to continue to move forward. So that's something to pay attention to. But as I mentioned before, to a previous point, bosses will begin to be added into the enemy pool for the Director to spawn. So here we have this Stone Titan who has spawned just kind of somewhere in the middle of this stage, which again adds that enemy variety and urgency. And here you see we have Grandparent. This is right in the beginning of this stage. And they just kind of spawn outright. Now they can only spawn in certain stages, and that's another thing that the Director can play with, is certain enemies are in certain stages and only exist within them. But as we progress, we see this change in enemy varieties. We have these different ones flying up in the sky, some on the ground, ones we haven't seen yet in any of these clips. And as a matter of fact, in my runs, they had not shown up. And to demonstrate how the scaling kind of fits into everything, we see in the beginning we had one boss, maybe two, now we're getting 3 at a time. But something to point out is that the way that they're scaling, they're trying to scale up with the player and the items that they're getting and the stats that they have. As I mentioned before, notches will increase difficulty every so often. You can see this up in the top right. We're up in ha. So that's kind of the infinite difficulty level, but they still get harder. They still get stat boosts to try to catch up with the player. And this scaling is a little bit different from the player scaling, which is based on XP. As you can see on the bottom left, level 22. It's based on killing enemies and getting XP. Monsters just kind of get it. And as a final example here, we have the last bit of these spawners. This is kind of at the end game, so it does have strict rules sometimes. Only these guys can spawn at the end. So, general overview of all of this. I think this is one of the best examples of a enemy spawning system and the way that it uses credits to create variety and an urgency throughout most of its time. Even though it's not perfect, I still think it's one of the best around and a great example to study.